So good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for being here. I'm Jocelyn Kennedy. I'm the Executive Director of the Harvard Law School Library, and I want to thank you all for being with us today for our book talk. Before I get started, just a few housekeeping things. Copies of the book are on sale at the front of the room, so if you would like to purchase a copy at the end of our talk, you may do so. And I believe our authors will be on hand for a little while to sign the book if you'd like to get your copy signed. Today's talk is being recorded by the law school, including the question and answer period, and it will be made available on our YouTube channel in the next few days, certainly by next week. I'd also like to thank the Dean's Office for their generous support of our book talks, particularly lunch today. Okay, so with all of that out of the way, it's my pleasure to introduce our authors and our panel who are here today to discuss the new book, Fault Lines in the Constitution, the Framers, Their Fights, and the Flaws That Affect Us Today. This is the first young adult book that we featured in our book talk, so it's particularly exciting to sort of think about, for me anyway, from an educator's standpoint, how we talk to young people about the law so that when they come to us as law students, we sort of have this sort of baseline and framework. So that's my personal pitch about the book. Our authors are Cynthia Levinson. She's a nonfiction author of young adult literature for and about young people. Sandy Levinson, who's a visiting professor of law here at HLS, and is the W. St. John Garwood and W. St. John Garwood Jr. Centennial Chair in Law at the University of Texas Law School. They're joined by our panelists, Professor R. Shep Melnick, the Thomas P. O'Neill, or Tip O'Neill as we know him in Boston, Professor of American Politics at BC, Professor Daniel Carter, the Allie S. Freed Professor of Government and Director of Social Sciences at the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study here at Harvard, Dan Covino, the Lawrence S. Pidgeon Director, Education Professions Community at Grinnell College, and Amy Shine Jones, a member of the History Department at Haverhill High School. So without further ado, I will turn it over to our panel. Thank you for being here.
Yes, and thank you very, very much for having us. One of the motifs, Cynthia and I today will talk just very briefly, because most of the time certainly should be spent on this very interesting panel. So the motif is, why is this book and why is this luncheon different from all other books and luncheons? And one tip-off has already been given. This book is directed at teenagers. And the publisher says from 10 to 18, we tend to think 12 to 18, but it's clearly directed at youngsters. But quite frankly, my own hope is that it will also be read by a fair number of the youngsters' grandparents, parents, aunts, uncles, brothers, and sisters, because the theme of the book certainly picks up on many things I've written over the years now and talked about in other presentations here in books written for adult audiences. That is problems with the Constitution, and in particular problems with parts of the Constitution that quite frankly are almost never taught even at our best law schools, because they're not subject to litigation, and maybe only rarely taught even in social studies courses in high school, because wrongly the topics we focus on are often thought to be dull and boring rather than the really extraordinarily vital topics they are. One last comment about the title, Fault Lines. This obviously is drawn from the earthquake geology, and it's the essence of fault lines that one can often ignore them. I went to law school at Stanford, which is on top of a major fault line. Everybody knows about the San Francisco earthquake, but you just deny it if you live in the Bay Area, and that often is a rational response. Because the odds are that it's not going to happen, at least while you're there for 3 years or 5 years. But if it does happen, it'll be catastrophic. And so we focus on varied fault lines in the Constitution, some of which are quite near the surface, like the Electoral College, others of which are almost unknown, except to people who are real specialists, which the continuity in government problem, but they all threaten misfortune or out-and-out catastrophe if they're not confronted. And so we hope that beginning with teenagers, but going all the way up to the grandparents, that we're actually generating a long overdue conversation that frankly tends to be absent from the literature for any audience.
So what are some of these fault lines? Sandy points out that often in civics ed or in social studies courses in high schools, the focus is on rights and debates about rights. So it's very engaging to students, but they're missing the underpinnings of the government. So as an example, the Senate. We have a chapter on the Senate and the inequities in the Senate. Each chapter begins with a story. What does that chapter begin with? No, actually it's 9/11, but Sandy mentioned corn, and that's a very good example. So the chapter begins with a story about 9/11 and the allocation of funding or misallocation of funding for the Patriot Act, and how some states, because Patrick Leahy from a teeny tiny state was in charge of the process for determining the funding allocations, was able to get outsized allocations for tiny states, per capita. The corn example, though, has to do with the fact that a graphic that we give in the book indicates that less than half the population of the United States, 150 million people, are spread across 41 states, which means they get 82 senators, whereas the remaining 153 million people in the United States live in only 9 states, getting only 18 senators. Now, some of those people who are spread out in some of those agricultural, those small states, their senators care a lot about corn subsidies, which is why we have a graphic in the book also on the prevalence of corn syrup. I hope you're enjoying your lunch. What are some of the others? Well, Sandy mentioned the Electoral College. That's an obvious one. So is what I call gerrymandering, he calls gerrymandering. Voting rights also. We also have a chapter on restrictions on running for government. We tend to tell kids in school, you could grow up to be president. Well, because of various restrictions having to do with immigration status, length of time in the country, age, only about a third of the people in the country actually are eligible to run for the presidency, and not too many more than that are eligible to run for Congress or for the Senate. So those are examples of some of the fault lines. We have 18 of them here. The book is set up really for schools. We even grade the Constitution based on the standards, the rubric of the preamble. The preamble lays out what the Constitution is there for. And so given what I think of as the bullet points, the more perfect union, establishing justice, promoting domestic tranquility, etc., we grade the Constitution, and we invite all of you to also. Then in the end of the book, we have a debate between the two of us, which you could actually hear if you want to get the audio version of the book, which we recorded, about what do we do now. But I think we would like to stop and let the panelists talk about their perspective on the book.
I guess I'll go first. It's really a pleasure to be here. And I actually have 3 reasons that I'm glad to be here. First, Sandy and I have a long-running debate, which I think we will continue here to some extent. We have a somewhat different view of our constitutional structures. My second reason is that my wife is a psychologist, and she's always wanted to write a children's book. So I was trying to get some insight in how you write books for children. This has been helpful. And the third, but most important reason, is that civics education is incredibly important, and I think is, from my perspective of teaching freshmen and sophomores, has not been done at all adequately. And I think that to think about how we can do it better, and to have this example of this book doing it better, is extraordinarily important. So I have basically, I'm going to have a few things about why I think the strengths of this book. I'll have some criticisms, and I'll have a suggestion, and then end up raising a question that I do not consider to be a rhetorical question. So I think that the primary strength of this book is that it brings American politics and constitutional questions alive by embedding them in controversy. If you just try to talk to kids about structures, they're immediately going to doze off. But what this book does so well is to say that these were choices that we need to evaluate. Were they good choices or were they bad choices? And if you look at the United States in comparative perspective, you could say we're exceptional. I always tell my students we got to realize that the United States is weird. We're really different from other countries. And why do we do it this way? What are the advantages and disadvantages? So in other words, to let people know that this could have been different and to get them to evaluate the arguments for doing it this way versus doing some other way. And I think that unless you embed your discussion in that type of political controversy, you're not going to get their attention. And if you do it this way, and I think the book invites us to do it this way, you also get the kids to think about how do you debate things reasonably, how do you engage in civil political discourse. And I don't need to tell you that's a pretty big matter in the world today, in the United States today, given what the president is doing. So how can we debate things civilly and rationally? And so you have to model what it means to be a person who engages that type of debate. Now, I do have a couple of criticisms of the book, and I'll lay them out quickly and then offer a suggestion. My view, I think that the book does a great job laying out the problems with the Constitution and criticisms of the Constitution. I think it could have done a better job laying out some of the counter-arguments, the original rationale for some of our constitutional structures. And I'll give you just a couple of quick examples. The Electoral College. The students I come in contact just think that the Electoral College is horrible and an anachronism, should be done away with. And when I present some arguments in favor of the Electoral College, talking especially about what simple majoritarianism would do to the structure of campaigns, to the nature of recounts, to the distribution of authority, to what it does to federalism, the response is, oh, I really hadn't thought about any of that. So I think if we had more of a discussion of what are the advantages of some of these institutions, it would be advantageous. Now, I've got to say, and I'm really interested in what some of you think about this. When I teach this to sophomores, all the students are very much opposed to the Electoral College, but they seem quite content with the Senate. And this, to me, sounds weird. I mean, there's one thing I could change in American government, it would be what Cynthia was talking about, the distribution of power in the Senate. But the students don't seem concerned about that. So if someone can explain to me why that is, I would really appreciate it. Second, bicameralism. This is part of the old debate I've had with Sandy of the advantages of having a complicated legislative process. That means it's hard to get legislation passed. Sometimes that's bad, but often it's good. I mean, quite frankly, I hope that the legislative process stops this tax cut from being passed. I was glad to see a lot of other legislation this session of Congress hasn't passed. And here I think that it would be advantageous to have the students read Federalist Paper number 10. This would be a great place to say, what is the advantage of this complicated legislative process with multiple veto points? And third, I'd point out their praise for the referenda, and the voice of the people. I don't know many political scientists who think that this is a good exercise in democracy. I think some indication of how ill-informed most people are on ballot questions, the importance of special interest in money, and the extent to which this takes power away from elected representatives who are expected to balance all of the competing interests in politics. And if you want to have a good example of what's wrong with referenda, just look at California. Anyone here from California? I'm sure you can add to that. So here's my suggestion. That a wonderful way to supplement this book would be to try to find good readings that provide a rational defense of some of these structures. And in particular, I know this is not probably won't work for high school students, but maybe for high school teachers, to present the Madisonian perspective. You could have them read Madison, but I'd say you also have them read Jonathan Rauch from the Brookings Institution, who's written a couple of excellent articles in The Atlantic about the advantage of a system that makes heavy use of intermediaries, of middlemen, to temper some of the democratic passions, and the type of view of political action that lies behind the Madisonian scheme. Now, here's my question. Should we try to instill veneration for the Constitution? Madison thought that was absolutely essential. Why? Because he was afraid of public passions overwhelming our constitutional institutions. Now, as a teacher, veneration can be really a problem. Because as a teacher, what we want to do is to not have kids take things on authority, but answer them for themselves. So in the classroom, veneration's not too good. But I would just leave you with this. In an era in which we see repeated denigration of institutional limitations and repeated denigration of political discourse, isn't this a time in which veneration of some of our older institutions and norms is particularly valuable? So I'll leave you with that thought.
Thank you. Yeah. Amy.
Hi. My name is Amy Jones. I am a high school history teacher. I teach in Haverhill, and I also taught in Reading. So I've taught middle school and high school for 25 years, and I may not be as much of an expert on the Constitution as some of the other folks up here, but I am an expert on one thing, and that is teenagers. I know teenagers. And so when I read this book, I read it with a sense of how would my students react to this book? What would they think of it? How would it connect with them or not connect with them? And I think that this book has many places in it that would help engage teenagers in becoming more active citizens, more critical thinkers, and having adolescents become the kind of active citizens we want them to become at a young age may mean that they'll become lifelong voters or participants in the political process, which is what we all hope. So the first thing I want to say about teenagers is their key task, according to Eric Erickson, is to figure out their identity. They ask themselves, who am I? They're trying on different hats. They're trying out different hairstyles, piercings, various ways of dressing. And along with that, they're also trying to figure out what they're going to be like as adults. And teachers have a great opportunity to say that one of the things you are is a citizen, and explore what that means, and explore what the duties and responsibilities and benefits of citizenship are. This book has a lot of ways of looking at citizenship and participation of citizens throughout the different chapters.
Sorry, excuse me.
That's okay. The other thing that kind of goes hand in hand with the search for identity is that teenagers are very egocentric. It's all about them. And what is great about this book is it does sort of feature a story at the beginning of each chapter, which gives the students an opportunity to connect with people that maybe are going through something they can relate to. For example, in chapter 4, they talk about the DREAM Act, and they focus on a young person who is having trouble because she doesn't have papers, and she didn't even realize that she wasn't a citizen. And then it gets into lots of details about the Constitution, but the opening kind of hooks the reader and gets the reader to want to know more. I think that a lot of the chapters help kids engage with real-world issues that they hear about on the news and that they're talking about amongst themselves, and they may see themselves somehow in these stories. Third, I think teenagers are desperate for a sense of self-efficacy. They want to feel like they can make a difference. They want to feel like there's a point in voting and that it matters, or that their participation isn't for nothing. A lot of students are kind of questioning, well, why does it matter if I vote anyway? It's not going to make a difference, or I don't care about that stuff. I don't pay attention to the news. It doesn't have anything to do with me. And especially when you teach about old documents like the Constitution, they say, why do I care about that? That was written so many years ago. I think that this book shows them that average citizens have helped to shape the Constitution. Their participation has influenced how our government has been formed. And in Chapter 7, there is a section on affirmative action in Michigan, and there's a case where a student she considers herself a victim of affirmative action, but she takes measures to eliminate that through, I believe it was an initiative or a referendum. And I think that it shows that an average person can make a difference, and that makes kids feel like they can become a citizen who can be an agent of change. Chapter 20 actually gives some suggestions for what to do next. If we want to make some changes along these fault lines, how do we go about it? The fourth thing is that teenagers love to fight. They love to argue, they love to debate, they love to be right. And there are so many areas in this book where there are debates that are, really hotly contested. And you may think that the Constitution is a really old, boring document, but when it comes to grading the Constitution, Chapter 19, for example, the kids can each take a section and see how they feel the Constitution should be graded before they even read what the book says. I've often had kids grade the presidents on foreign policy or domestic policy and things like that, but grading sections of the Constitution on how well they uphold the preamble, I think is a terrific way to get kids to argue. And many of the examples throughout the book lend themselves to in-class arguments. For example, even sort of talking about, well, a small state should have the same power as a big state, or maybe not, and how that plays out, even with the corn example, how small states in the Senate really have an unusually huge amount of power. And I bet a lot of students never really consider what the impact of that is. So engaging them in arguments about this stuff is a terrific way to use this book. And finally, teenagers have a huge ability to detect deception, and they really do know when they're being conned, and they really do know when people are sort of trying to get away with something, because probably they're trying to get away with something too. Chapter 5 about gerrymandering is a great chapter for talking about how the government, even though we have to kind of really respect the Constitution and appreciate that it's lasted so long, it's been, the model for other countries, but there are things in it that need to be addressed, and that there are ways that people kind of cheat. And the whole question about the Texas districting and the pictures they show of, I think there's like an upside down elephant and like something that looks like a snake. I don't know. But just to make it so that a certain candidate wouldn't win, you'll have to see it. But I think kids have a big, they have a sort of a need for things to be right and fair and just. And I think that chapter is a nice one for sort of engaging them and talking about maybe by the letter of the law what they're doing is right, but it's not the right thing to do or the moral thing to do. What this book, I think, I like about it is that it shows that the Constitution is a living document, and it really does, especially in the last couple chapters, encourage students to think about what next, what could they do to either improve upon our government or participate in our government, or at least have an opinion about it that matters, so that when they do become adults, they will see themselves as citizens. They will see their input as important, and they will see that the Constitution isn't just a dusty old document, but it really does have some meaning in their own lives. So I think teenagers will really appreciate a lot of things about this book. I'm glad you wrote it. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. I don't know, should we go back to Dan and then go on?
No, go ahead. Yeah, I was the last to arrive. I should be the last to speak.
So my name is Dan Covino. I work at Grinnell College, which is in Iowa. So this mention of corn subsidies and so forth, in small states with disproportionate amounts of power, spoke to things that I encounter. So my interest in civic education stems from a couple of different places. So before I started working at the college, I was a teacher at Grinnell High School for 4 years. So in the same community, and in this community, which is like this sort of the second reason why I'm interested in this book, is how communities and colleges can work together to increase civic education and civic engagement. The community of Grinnell right now is like a pretty interesting place to work because there are sharp distinctions, I think, between, and this may be true at other small liberal arts colleges in different parts of the country. There are sharp distinctions between like town-gown relations, but there are also sort of other connections that are made that not everyone knows about. So that's one of the ways that I kind of approach this book. And the third reason why I'm interested is a few years ago when I was teaching, I read a book called No Citizen Left Behind, which encouraged me, inspired me to go to graduate school at HDSC across the street. And Mira wrote that book. So that really informed my thinking. I guess when I was reading this book, it just made me, there were things in the book that I really appreciated. One of the things that we've talked about so far is how these matters are dealt with in different governments. And one of the ways in which the authors have chosen to approach this is to compare the U.S. Constitution to other countries' constitutions, but to other state constitutions as well. And I don't think, and Amy, I'm curious what your perspective is, I don't think many of our students, at least in high school, are aware very much of how other states approach these kinds of questions. So that was kind of one thing that stood out to me. There were others too, but I guess I also have like a series of questions that I'm curious about. And I also have, now that I'm working at the college, there are like two things that occurred to me that colleges, and maybe my own in particular, could do or continue to do to increase these like college community partnerships. One thing that I'm noticing is that career development offices, like the one I work in, are expanding as applicants are interested in like a return on investment. Like what kinds of jobs can they get when they graduate? The CDOs, the career development offices, and I work in a Center for Careers, Life, and Service. I think one thing that we can do a better job, or continue to try to do a better job, is to encourage students to go into public service. So that's like one thing that occurred to me. And I kind of just want to like throw these questions out and see what people think. One thing that most civics textbooks have is a copy of the Constitution in the text. This one had like a series of excerpts from relevant passages, but that wasn't included, and I was just kind of curious about that. I was also kind of curious if, in addition to grading the Constitution as it exists or as it's written, students could grade the process in which it was created. And like, is that a democratic process? If we were to create a new one, how would we think about it? So as I say, I like kind of approached this text as a former teacher and what kinds of assessments I would use, but also as somebody who's working with students who are interested in education and pursuing education professions.
I'll say a few things. I apologize for being late. As I had told Sandy and the organizers, I am right now from noon till 1:15 in between two teaching and advising obligations. So I just walked over from concluding my lecture in a undergraduate course called What is a Republic, whose enrollment tripled this semester for reasons you might be able to guess. And we're actually we're going to be debating over the next few weeks some of the very questions that are raised in this great book. And then my office hours start at 1:15, and I've got lots of anxious paper writers, so I apologize I can't stay long. Just three quick points about what I think are teachable moments from the book, and I think this is fantastic. This copy is going to my daughter. I'm going to buy another one for my son. So the first, I really like the fact, and this is so little known, even among college students, and I think it would be really important to kind of bring home the point, simply as a descriptive point to high school students. There are no national level referenda in the United States, right? And this book kind of points that out. And if we did have a democratic process on what a new constitution would look like, maybe that would exist. But right now it doesn't. And I think one can talk about the pros and cons of referenda in general. Is it a good thing when 50 plus a morsel percent of a state's population can add an amendment to that state's constitution that prevents people from marrying based on their sexual orientation identity, or does other things, raises taxes, things like that? I think one aspect of the small r Republican model that has shaped our country and has a long legacy is, in fact, that absence of referenda at the national level, again, for better or worse. I'm somewhat attracted, and when I talk about these, we debate these things in my undergraduate courses and have over the years. And generally, my students end up being skeptical of referenda for the reason I just mentioned, the idea of these majoritarian factions, almost as Madison would have remarked upon them. But what about giving the people the ability to, say, with a certain supermajority requirement, 55, 60% of the vote, the people to veto a law passed by Congress, right? Ohio actually has a constitutional provision that looks like this, and it was used under the first term of Governor John Kasich to undo basically an anti-union law. And that allows the people to have their voice directly. And actually, that is a pure majoritarian, so it's just a 50% threshold in Ohio, if I understand correctly. But it allows them to undo things that may have come through more kind of elite machinations through the legislature and the governor. And I think that's just a really important, subject to debate and to get, students thinking about what should be the ability of people just, directly to make policy from their votes. And I think that's a useful, teachable moment. The second I would argue is a really nice section is the war powers and emergency powers. And here's where things get tricky. I talk to my students all the time about, well, one of the big threats to the American Republic is the possibility of authoritarianism, the possibility that a president could, with the support of a party or party base combined with the military, basically undo some of our important constitutional arrangements, ignore the courts, arrest the opposition, things like that. And one of the first things I point to is there was an article written after the Trump election by I'm going to forget his name now. It was the Atlantic, on Nixon and how close we came to certain aspects of authoritarianism under Nixon. And I'm sorry, I'm blanking on the name for a moment. But maybe the best example is the Alien and Sedition Acts. I mean, which happened pretty early, right? And the idea, and I'm not saying those were necessarily authoritarian, but the idea that you can, there is not legitimate opposition. I mean, this was a debate about whether you could really have two parties, in an organized opposition, and whether or not you could, at a time clearly of instability economically and militarily, whether or not you could draw upon people's speech and political activities to declare them, alien or in sedition. So, my warning to my students is if, in fact, authoritarianism comes to the United States, it will probably be through the executive branch, not the others. And this calls in part for, a close examination of the powers that the president has. And a number of the cases cited in that chapter, 15, I believe, the chapter 15, but let me know if I'm wrong, are in fact about these different emergency powers that the president can call upon and the way that they can be abused, human rights and others. Finally, I would just remark that I think it's just to talk about the Iowa problem, having grown up in a small town in Michigan, where when I went off to college in 1985, the farmer that I worked for at the time said, I was going to Georgetown. I mean, I wasn't going to have any voice in Congress, but he said, "Go tell those members to watch after our subsidies," and these were for cherries, whether it's subsidies, whether it's the Electoral College, whether it's the disproportionate weight that small states, and given the way that our political geography works out, rural states have in the calculus of the U.S., and asking our students to say, okay, that might bother us, especially if we're living and teaching and learning in Massachusetts, but can you imagine a state of the world in which it might be true, which we don't want some collection of 5 or 6 states with half the population making the rules for the rest. And so I think of this book as being full of teachable moments and teachable questions. Those are the 3 that stood out to me, and I want to congratulate the authors on a masterstroke of educational work.
Thank you.
Let me start just very briefly. To answer Amy's question, I think, frankly, the reason the Constitution doesn't appear is that it would have taken up a lot of pages, and in the modern world, you can find the Constitution very, very easily all over the net. And just as in law school, I would argue we don't teach anything about vast parts of the Constitution that aren't litigated. The main thrust here are certain parts of the Constitution, and we, relatively speaking, ignore Article 1, Section 8, the powers of Congress, the Bill of Rights, which are litigated all the time, and which aren't the same sort of fault lines. If you don't like what the Supreme Court has done, then if you elect presidents and have a compatible Senate, you will get different decisions. But if you don't like the Senate, if you don't like the Electoral College, it may be more complicated. But some of it just comes to the economics of publishing. Would it have been worth taking 18 or 20 pages in big print for the Constitution? I think we quickly agreed with Peachtree that the answer was no. But take a couple more substantive topics. I'm delighted that Dan pointed out that one of the things that is different about this book is its comparative aspect, and that the most important comparisons are, as you suggested, to state constitutions, because for a variety of reasons, I think there is a hesitancy, shall we say, on the part of a lot of Americans to believe that we have anything to learn from France or Germany or whoever. But it gets harder to argue that we have nothing to learn from Ohio or Maine, which also has the provision that Dan Carpenter was talking about. I'm clearly more sympathetic to referenda than Shep is, but one of the things we hope happens in classrooms is that kids will actually debate about the merits of the quite weird U.S. Constitution when compared with almost all of the state constitutions. One quick example, all of you who are law students know about the unitary executive and the debate that the president has to control every single official of the executive branch. If you look at, I think, 47 of the states or 48 of the states, they don't have unitary executives, and some of them have wildly what Jacob Gerson calls unbundled executives, and that's just as much a part of the American constitutional tradition as the oddball 1787 Constitution. And what I really hope would happen is that kids would debate about it. The very last point before Cynthia takes over, about the issue of children's agency, which is a topic that Cynthia has written about in two really terrific books about the Children's March in Birmingham in 1963, which was an example of children's agency, not being manipulated by adults. But we now have a blog because every day brings new examples of potential fault lines. And we blogged about a 13-year-old in Vermont and two 16-year-olds and a 17-year-old in Kansas who are running for governor. And they're serious. They're very articulate. They have platforms. And my hope is that they'll participate in debates and will demonstrate that adult preconceptions about teenagers, that they're just congenitally thoughtless and have nothing interesting to say, might be disaffirmed, because the 13-year-old in Vermont is really terrific. And this all comes from the fact that there's no age limit on running for governor in Vermont or Kansas.
Yeah, I'll just be very brief because I'm sure there are questions here too. So first of all, thank you very, very much. Thank you for your kind comments about the book. And we do hope that it will be useful at a number of different levels. I love the fact that there was a debate right here about referenda. That's great. You modeled this disagreement. It's terrific. In terms of the rationale for why we have what we have, I guess I should just say a little bit about how we do have sections in each chapter called Meanwhile. Back in 1787, we describe to some extent why the framers came up with the ideas that they did, some of them cockamamie, some of them understandable under the pressures of time and heat and disagreement among them. But it is, and as Sandy often says, we do not want to engage in what he calls founder bashing. This book does focus on fault lines, but there are reasons that they came up with what they did. So it's an interesting idea to present those more fully or more carefully. Just one minor thing related to the blog. We are holding, for those of you who are interested, a blog a fault line contest. So all you need to do is register for the blog, www.faultlinesintheconstitution.com, and your students can write blogs and submit them. The winners get their blogs posted, 2 winners for different age groups. I didn't think about extending it beyond 18-year-olds. I may have to rethink this. And you get a free Skype session with Sandy and me. So, but thank you all very much. And do you want to call for questions?
Just want to pick up one more last point. Shep's question at the very end is extraordinarily important. That is a question of veneration. My first book, Constitutional Faith, which was published in 1988, in some way centered on the issue of viewing the Constitution as a sacred document, which incidentally nobody does with regard to state constitutions. People's hearts simply don't beat faster when they see their state constitutions, except maybe in Massachusetts because John Adams drafted it. But otherwise, it's treated instrumentally. And the U.S. Constitution is treated differently. And quite frankly, I think we way over-venerate the Constitution. But the problem is, both in my own work and in what Shep is saying, you have to be somewhat schizoid with regard to the Constitution, because some parts of the Constitution really are worth venerating, especially the preamble, in all seriousness. Other parts of the Constitution, I think, ought to be subjected to relentless criticism. And I think it is important pedagogically to figure out what I often call the Goldilocks point between, the book ends with a debate between Cynthia and me. I persist. I continue to support a new constitutional convention. Cynthia, like most of my friends, family, and professional colleagues, thinks that is basically crazy. And we, in fact, debate it in the last chapter, and you can hear us debate on the audio version. I don't want to scrap the Constitution. I don't think all of it should be junked, but I do think most of it should be questioned in a way that simply doesn't occur. And I do attribute part of the Trump phenomenon to justify frustration with the way the 1787 constitutional order works and the attraction of a demagogue who promises to cut the Gordian knot.
Yeah, sure.
And that's dangerous.
So, questions, comments, concerns?
Yep.
Yeah.
Does your book cover the filibuster, and if it does, what, oh, sorry. Does the book cover the filibuster, and if so, how did you handle that?
Well, Amy mentioned, she made reference to a dreamer. So there is a chapter on the filibuster, and the story that opens the chapter is about a young woman in her 20s, Lizzie Adala, who came to this country when she was 6 years old from Canada with her family. They all came legally. They all came with visas. They overstayed the visas, which Lizzie herself did not find out about until she was a junior or senior in college. When she found out about it, and when she was called actually to report to Immigration and Customs Enforcement, Customs, her mother said, basically, don't worry. Tomorrow there's a vote in the Senate on a bill that has already passed the House, having to do with young people who overstayed their visas or came here illegally. It already passed the House. The president has promised to sign it. It looks as if there's majority support for it in the Senate. The majority of the population, U.S. population, supports this. So they were thinking they were going to be fine. However, that bill was filibustered. It never came up for a vote because an insufficient number of senators to overcome a filibuster wanted to bring it to that point.
45 beats 55 in the Senate. How this gets linked with the Constitution is a thoroughly justifiable provision of the Constitution that gives each House the ability to set its own rules, which has to be the case. The Constitution can't set out all sorts of arcane rules. But I think it's fair to say that nobody in 1787 was contemplating the filibuster rules, Rule 22 of the Senate, that does give an intense minority the ability to block legislation. We also talk at the very beginning of the book on why there was no anti-lynching bill passed, and one was introduced back around 1920 by a Republican member of Congress from St. Louis, supported by the underrated Republican Warren Harding, and it never got to a vote in the Senate because white Southern Democrats had a lock, and they had a lock on civil rights legislation until the 1960s.
And I think these examples also get to what Amy was talking about in terms of kids caring about fairness. It sounds like you wanted to add something to this. No?
I'll just add one thing to amplify what Sandy said about the filibuster in the Constitution. Not only was it not contemplated, but in the early Senate, they did have shut-off debate by pure majority vote. So clearly that the filibuster is not some constitutionally embedded institution. The filibuster is, I say, worse than you can ever imagine. Because it allows for unanimous consent agreements and block all kinds of action. But it is probably on its way out because it can be changed by majority vote.
Other comments?
Yep.
I'll slip in two quick questions. The National Popular Vote Compact Initiative is I guess an end run around the Constitution. I don't know if it's included in your book, but I'd love to have your opinion on that topic. And my other short question, I guess we know today that since the population of California is 72 times the population of one of the smallest states,
Wyoming,
that if I moved to Wyoming, I would have 72 times as much influence over the Senate as if I lived in California. Was that difference, that divergence, as great in the 1790s as it is now?
I'll take the last one first. It was 17-1 with Delaware and Virginia. James Madison, who has already been adverted to, hated that feature of the Senate. He referred to it in Federalist 62 as a lesser evil. I want to focus on the word evil. The word lesser comes from the undoubtedly true fact that if there hadn't been capitulation to the extortionate demand of Delaware and some other states, there wouldn't have been a constitution. So one of the things that students can do usefully is to debate compromise itself, where you draw lines, whatever the consequences, and when you swallow very, very hard. And the other example, of course, is slavery, which rests on no higher moral ground, I believe, than the Senate does, and which those compromises continue to afflict us.
And in terms of the national popular vote, we do talk about that. The end of each chapter includes what are the other ways, and in this last chapter on, now what, we do talk about end runs around the Electoral College. We list the 11 states which theoretically a presidential candidate could win and then win the presidency. Only 11 states because of the distribution of population. And so that is one method. It's problematic. But
the initiative is, it wouldn't require actually winning the 11 states. The initiative is that the 11 states promise to direct their electors to vote for the winner of the national popular vote. I have extremely mixed feelings about that. It would resolve the problem of 2000 and 2016. It does nothing to resolve the problem of 1860, 1912, 1968, or 1992, when the first-past-the-post winners all got to the White House, but with considerably short of 50% of the vote. So I want a runoff system or the alternative transferable vote. I would not be thrilled with a system that would generate more and more Richard Nixons and Bill Clintons, each of whom got to the White House with 43% of the vote, and there's just no way of knowing what would have happened had there been a runoff.
Just to add to that, I'm going to sound a little too much like a Francophile here, but so France has both a national popular vote and a runoff. And the benefit of the runoff is not simply that the final winner of the election has the full, quantitative legitimacy of over 50% of the vote. It's also that there's 2 weeks in between that first round of voting and the second round of voting. If you are any bit as afraid of the prospect of somebody like Marine Le Pen running a country as I am, then you should be thankful that those 2 weeks intervened, because that's when Macron not only decisively beat her, but beat her party so bad that she's effectively gone into political retirement. It gave people a chance to first vote out of frustration, the kind of up yours vote that a lot of people registered, let's be honest, in 2016, and then to take a second look at a vote 2 weeks later, and to reflect. Now, there should be social scientific study of what I'm suggesting, namely that resting period allows for greater moderation, and to what extent that's true. But in several cases, I've seen that happen, where in France that 2 weeks allows people to kind of cool their jets a little bit. People are voting a little less against somebody and a little bit more for somebody. Things like that.
You don't have to be a Francophile. You could be a Georgia-phile.
Oh, sure.
Because the state of Georgia has the same sort of runoff system. And this, again, this just underscores the importance of teaching kids that the United States Constitution is not the only game in town, where the town is even your own state.
Yeah.
Actually, I have a somewhat whimsical point that what teachers might do is to try to challenge the students to find something in the Constitution that they didn't know was there. For example, something that I didn't know was there until relatively recently is the compact clause, which comes up when you're talking about these agreements by the states, because the Constitution said there can't be any compact between among the states unless Congress approves it. Basically the Supreme Court has read that out of the Constitution, but you might get them to think about why that is and how it would affect this opportunity to...
Another extraordinarily obscure clause that we talk about at length is the clause that requires that every member of the House of Representatives be elected. You might think that's a good idea. Who really cares if there are 432 representatives instead of 435 representatives at a given point? You might like the fact that the representatives would go to election. But we have a long chapter on continuity in government. What would have happened if Flight 93 had actually crashed into the Capitol and had killed, let us say, 300 members of the House? The last thing in the world one would want under those circumstances is to wait 45 or 60 or 75 days to have elections. You would want what we can do, in effect, with dead senators, which is to replace them literally the next day.
By the governor.
Or by the governor can do that in most states. I'm really quite confident that very few people know of that provision, because most of the time it really doesn't matter. But it's a classic fault line, because it could help to explain why you would be governed by a military dictatorship under conditions of where continuity in government becomes questionable, and then everybody says, well, the governor just can't appoint members of the House, and the quorum turns out to be 11 of the 20 remaining members of the House, which is crazy.
Oh, yes, Richard.
Hello, what a fascinating panel. Hi, Richard Albert. In addition to asking students to read the Constitution to see something, to find something they didn't know was in there, you might do the opposite. Ask them to read the Constitution to see what is not in there. The Harlan Institute has done some studies into this and found that most people think that Miranda rights are written into the text of the Constitution. Of course, they're not. I have maybe three questions. First for Sandy and Cynthia. How was the sausage made? How did you guys come together to write this book, actually do the writing of the book together? Another question, I guess, is for Amy. I'm interested in how you think your students read the Constitution, how they feel when they read it, and see that some of them may not be represented in the actual wording of the Constitution. So I begin my first year con law class, or I did last year, by asking whether Hillary Clinton was unconstitutional as a candidate. The text of the Constitution, of course, refers only to he or his when it speaks of the president, not to her or she. Now, of course, the answer is yes, she can run. She's not unconstitutional, but it's a beautiful exercise into reading the text carefully, into thinking about originalism, thinking about living constitutionalism, the role of the Supreme Court in modernizing our Constitution outside of the iron cage of Article 5, as Sandy calls it. So your students, when they read the Constitution, women, girls, African Americans who still see, we all still see in the text the 3/5 clause, the unamendable provision that makes the slave trade unchangeable for 20 years. So what do they say about that? One more question, I guess, for Shep and Sandy. You've had a long-standing debate about gridlock, the vices and virtues of gridlock. And I guess I just wonder whether the current political configuration we have in Washington is causing either of you to rethink your position on gridlock. I would think that maybe Shep ends up getting the better of things. I'm not sure, Sandy, what you think about that, but Fascinating panel, all of you. Thank you very much.
Thanks. We'll go very quickly because I want to hear from Shep and Amy too. It came about because my editor of the previous books that Sandy mentioned asked us if we do it. And we agreed. Basically, that's sort of the concrete response, how this book came about.
How did you actually write it? How did you get together?
Oh, that's longer than we have. I'll be glad to talk with you. But I think for this time period and audience, why don't we hear from Amy and then Chip?
Well, my high school students, when they are reading the Constitution, oftentimes are really overwhelmed by the language, first of all. So even getting them to understand what it says is a challenge. But when they do start learning about some of the compromises, they get offended and they feel personally offended by it. And I think we want to respect the Constitution as a long-standing document and revere what it stands for, but I don't think we want to do that without pointing out the fault lines and also letting students know that it's people like them who were the people that pushed back and tried to make the country better and then resolve some of these problems in the Constitution. So giving them a sense that it's not a perfect document, but it's pretty darn good, and your job as a citizen is to have, a role in our country moving forward. So to make them feel hopeful about fixing some of those mistakes.
Let me say that Richard raised the issue of the 3/5 clause, and we talked about the Senate. And one thing that we have to keep in mind is that slavery had a profound effect on the nature of the Constitution. At the same time, slavery is not mentioned in the Constitution. They had the good sense to be ashamed of it, and therefore they didn't mention it. But obviously, an enormous amount of constitutional amendment has been aimed at dealing with that long-term legacy, and that's one of the major motors of all of American politics. On the question of gridlock, on the one hand, yes, I do feel somewhat vindicated. The advantages of not passing legislation, I think, are more clear. But as with everything in politics, there's always a flip side. And the flip side is when you can't do things through legislation, you try to do through court action or executive action. And we are seeing that in spades now, and that should deeply concern us.
Yeah, I think Shep and I might be more in agreement than you think. I remember, actually, this was 1962, I was working Capitol Hill, and I went to observe the Senate while Paul Douglas, a liberal senator from Illinois, was filibustering the Communications Satellite Act of 1962. And Douglas was a vehement opponent of the filibuster, which had generally been used by Southern segregationists. And so somebody asked him, I never forgot, and he said, well, I don't believe in unilateral disarmament. And so if we can block every single piece of the Trump agenda, that's fine with me. But it does seem to me, both politically and pedagogically, that one has to bring the camera out and say, there's nothing wrong with using whatever the political system gives you at time X to achieve your political purposes. But if you think in terms of design, a system that should last more than this limited period of time, is it really such a good idea to have so many veto points and that generate the kind of frustration that helped to create the Trump phenomenon? And so I really, our argument certainly continues that even if I'm grateful at this moment for veto points that I want my team to use, I remain at most uncertain and probably still pretty much persuaded that we're not well served as a political system by the extent of the veto points.
I feel I should intervene at this point. It is past the time that we announced, and we don't want to prevent you from buying the book, after all. And the conversation can continue on the
Dan has
blog.
office hours.
Right, Dan has office. The conversation continue among each other, with us, on our blog. Thank you so very much. We really appreciate it. And thank you to the library.